So we are very excited today. We've got Caroline Bainbridge, who is Professor of Culture and Psychoanalysis at Roehampton. She's got lots of accolades. The film section editor of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, author of multiple books and anthologies on psychoanalysis and popular culture. She is a research associate at the Freud Museum in London, a founding scholar at the British Psychoanalytic Council. And she's a regular writer and gives talks on psychoanalysis, gender, television, cinema, and popular culture. And she'll be talking to us about that today. So the structure of our talk, Caroline's going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. And at the end, we're going to have about 10 minutes for questions. So it will probably be best if I can ask you to hold off on your questions until the end. And in the end, you can certainly ask your questions. If there's anything really important and you're worried that you're going to forget it, you're welcome to write things in the chat as well, but they'll be attended to at the end in the last 10 minutes. So when we're finished at around 7 o'clock, we're going to just invite everyone to stay. Usually if we were doing this in person, we would all be heading off to the pub across the street. So we are going to try to do that virtually and have a little bit more of an informal chat after the talk. And Caroline has warmly agreed to be there as well, so we can continue the conversation then. So I think that's everything from me. So some people are saying that they can't hear any sound. Has everyone heard that? Yeah, okay, I'm getting some nods, so I'm just going to continue. All right, I think that's it for me, so I'm going to hand it over to Caroline. So very warm welcome to you.
Thanks so much, Petra, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to you and Nick for inviting me to present my work this evening, and to all of you, in fact, for coming along in what I think is now known as Locktail Hour. So giving up your cocktails in favour of a Zoom pub follow, that sounds good to me. I hope you can all hear me okay, and I'm getting a bit of feedback, so I'm not sure if everybody is muted. It would be great if you could all mute your mics. Thanks so much. Okay, give me a second, I'll just share my slides and then we'll make a start. Okay, so I'm going to speak this evening on a paper that I've devised and recently published called Who Will Fix It For Us? Toxic Celebrity and the Therapeutic Dynamics of Media Culture. And as I think we all know all too well, sadly, recent years have brought to light a very large number of historical sex abuse scandals involving celebrities such as Jimmy Savile in the UK, and Harvey Weinstein in the US, although of course the revelations around sex abuse have also involved other organisations such as the church. But I'm going to focus in this talk this evening specifically on the celebrity scandals, and very particularly on the Savile case, which I'm going to use as a case study to explore my main question, which is, do the various reworkings of celebrity scandals provide a therapeutic experience for us as onlookers? And if they do, how does this work? And a secondary question is, how does our fascination with celebrity in the 21st century play into this experience? When I started thinking about this, I decided that to explore these ideas, I wanted to draw on the various archives documenting the public experience of the Savile scandal. And so I looked specifically at the media treatment of the case by looking at UK news coverage. So I looked at print media coverage in particular, but I also wanted to look more broadly. So I considered the documentaries, there are quite a lot of them, focused on Savile, and also the emerging critical and academic archive around the case, much of which is also feminist in scope. So I wanted to try to pay attention to what we in cultural studies call the discursive surrounds of the case, the things that are being said about it, the things that are being critically argued in response to it, and to think about the way that the process of mediating its various elements, or actually giving it coverage in the media context, might help me to understand what I was really interested in, which is the psychological processes involved in all of it. So in other words, what I'm interested in is thinking about What happens at a psychological level when celebrity culture and the institutions that support it fail us as ordinary people? How do we deal with what I think of as the emotional and psychological fallout, excuse me, when we witness the desecration of these stars and our attachments to these stars, who are really very much loved, beloved by us and laden with nostalgia, so that they have meaning for us as individuals with our own personal memories. So I think there's a considerable amount of emotional work involved when our faith in our celebrity icons and their symbolic meaning collapses in the way that they have done in this case. I'm going to suggest to you that this is processed or worked through, to use a psychoanalytic term, via the opportunities afforded to us by media culture, but also by those opportunities afforded to us by critical analysis and by our personal investment in media objects. In other words, objects that we have living and alive inside our minds and our imaginations. So hopefully this might shed light on what I think of as the dynamics of feeling, or a little bit more precisely, the psychological stakes, if you like. I'm going to argue that media and celebrity culture offer a really valuable way of grappling with painful experience. I'm going to suggest that they allow emotion, and very raw emotion, to surface and therefore to be worked through. And also that they give us space to imagine or to envision what needs to change and what needs to be to ensure that cases such as the Savile scandal should never again go unchanged. Now, it's really important to say, before I begin to talk more in detail about any of this, that I'm not suggesting that the mediatisation I'm going to discuss provides therapeutic closure for survivors of abuse. Clearly, that's not the case. And despite the willingness of some survivors to participate in media examinations of abuse, closure certainly doesn't come from any guarantee that there will be witnesses to the stories being told, or from any kind of sense that experience is being authenticated by dint of media coverage and commentary. So when I'm referring to the therapeutic dynamic, what I have in mind is the broader context of attitudes and emotional experience in the general public. Okay, so I'm going to start by thinking a little bit about Savile and the scandal at the BBC, and to kind of trace a little bit the emergent archives around the case. Now, in 2012, the BBC got caught up in a scandal about allegations of sexual abuse, including against children, perpetrated by the celebrity DJ and TV presenter Jimmy Savile, who had died the year before in 2011. And Savile had been a key light entertainment celebrity at the BBC for over 30 years before his death. And he seemed to be fixed in national consciousness in a very particular way. So, for example, the so-called media morality campaigner Mary Whitehouse gave him an award for providing what she referred to as wholesome entertainment. Savile was especially well known in this country as the sole host of the programme Jim Will Fix It, which was a family show that ran for nearly 20 years. And the aim of this show was ostensibly to make the wishes of young people come true. Now, Savile was also a regular presenter on Top of the Pops, which was a weekly roundup of chart music in which juvenile studio guests were really encouraged to dance and interact with presenter DJs. Now, at the time of his death, Savile was widely praised in the UK media for the charitable work that he'd done with critically ill and disabled minors. And this was a narrative that really shone through in the obituaries. The media, following immediately on from his death, celebrated his life and treated him as an emblem of what they referred to as the wild and wacky and eccentric aspects of a bygone era of entertainment. But this sensibility wasn't just limited to the obituaries, it was also abroad in the public response to Savile's death, as I'll go on to discuss in a few minutes. And so there was a very public work of mourning a so-called national treasure, and this seemed to echo the saccharine media coverage. In 2012, however, there was also a standoff between TV channels around Savile's life as a hidden life as a criminal abuser. And the Metropolitan Police disclosed allegations of the star's involvement in the abuse of upwards of 450 people over more than 50 years. This is truly a heinous case. The Met Police set up an investigation known as Operation U-Tree. And this was an investigation into complaints that Savile and other celebrities had carried out predatory acts of abuse over a really significant period of time. And it was launched as soon as the TV allegations about his behaviour were on show. And the disclosure of these allegations really led to lots of new questions, specifically around what had been known when at the BBC. And so the public mood of nostalgia following on from Savile's death and the coverage of his funeral very quickly seemed to transform into a mood of revilement and desecration. Now, throughout this expose, newspapers tended to report on witness accounts about Savile's behaviour and the rumours circulating all around it. So newspapers did things like have interviews with former controllers of Radio 1 and BBC 1, debates with the former BBC chairman Michael Grade, and other celebrity presenters such as Paul Gambaccini, whom of course police later arrested on what turned out to be false charges of historical sexual allegations as part of their investigations in U-Tree, and the case was eventually dropped once Gambaccini had spent a year on bail. At the same time, of course, a number of other BBC celebrities were being arrested and even tried and prosecuted, showing exactly the extent of the culture of abuse and the willingness inside the BBC to disavow this abusive behaviour. Abuse, it seemed, was really endemic there. Now, before these revelations came to light following Savile's death, there had been some journalists who had been attentive to the allegations that had been made over time. And I'm thinking here of specific investigations done by the journalist Lynn Barber in an interview published in 1990, and later in the well-known TV documentary called When Louis Met Jimmy, made by Louis Theroux in 2000. And these interviews suggested that in lots of ways there had actually been widespread tacit knowledge of Savile's paedophilia well before the police disclosures in 2012. Despite this, though, historical complaints that had already been made to the police about Savile as early as 1958 and also in 2007 and 2008 had been dropped by the police. And this was apparently due to a lack of reliable evidence to proceed with the investigations. But by 2012, though, the true extent to which the BBC had turned a blind eye to the activities of Savile and other celebrities such as Rolf Harris and Stuart Hall had come to light, and it transpired that senior executives at the BBC had indeed colluded to cancel the transmission of a Newsnight special investigation into these perpetrators. It was just at this time, so just around the time of Savile's death and reflections upon it in 2012, that ITV, a rival channel to the BBC, broadcast its rather damning documentary called Exposure, The Other Side of Jimmy Savile. And it became at this point very clear that the BBC had covered up the allegations. So media commentators finally began to blow the whistle. Now, following on from these allegations and these revelations, there was a lot of preoccupation with the question of who knew what when around this case. And to some extent, this was fueled by the not inconsiderable amount of time taken by Dame Janet Smith to investigate and publish her report arising from her official review. And media commentary on the case also persisted over time. In fact, media commentary on this case hasn't gone away. Articles referencing the Savile investigation, the Savile case, continue even today. So just last week, for instance, both newspapers and the BBC referred to the Savile investigation as a model for the review of Martin Bashir's 1995 interview with Diana, Princess of Wales. And in the ongoing current Kids Club court case, Camilla Batman-Chelidge has blamed the moral panic around the Savile case for the demise of her charity. Last week also, there was an adult victim of a paedophile in Hull who credited the media coverage of the Savile scandal with galvanising him into action on reporting his abuse. So it's a really key figure of imagination and point of cultural reference in the context of abuse and the treatment of abuse more broadly in culture and treatments of revelation of that abuse. There have, of course, also been numerous TV documentaries since these revelations took place and focused on the scandal. So the BBC itself in 2016 broadcast a new documentary called Abused: The Untold Story. And in the same year, Louis Theroux revisited his controversial interviews with Savile following on from the publication of the Smith Report. And he made a new documentary in which he tried to give voice to some of Savile's female victims. And of course, this gave Theroux an opportunity to try to undo some of the deeply uncomfortable consequences of his earlier professed admiration for Savile, and so therefore to try to detoxify himself and rehabilitate his own reputation, which had actually suffered quite a blow. So these examples, I think, indicate the Savile case media archive that I referred to earlier on. And remarking on this archive, the feminist scholar Karen Boyle has suggested that the documentaries especially explicitly build on one another, and indeed on previous accounts of Savile, notably Theroux's When Louis Met Jimmy. And this results in quite considerable repetition, including of victim survivor testimony, which, she argues, works to create a new televisual archive, heightening the sense that these documentaries are fundamentally about television as well as being television. Now, I think Boyle makes really interesting and important observations here, but I want to suggest that the growth of the re-envisaged Savile archive is not just confined to documentary and news media. Popular culture in the UK has also turned its gaze to the scandal and its fallout. And this is where I want to draw attention to some examples of this. So in June 2015, Brendan O'Hay staged Jonathan Maitland's play, An Audience with Jimmy Savile, at the Park Theatre in London. And it was staged to mixed reviews. So in The Guardian, critic Lynn Barber, who had interviewed Savile, remember, decried the play's failure to explain how people fell for what she calls Savile's sleight of hand, despite the best intentions of all involved. But over in The Independent, the critic Paul Taylor refuted this kind of charge, and he suggested that the play was a responsibly shocking, well-researched and patently honourable piece. In the Daily Mail, Quentin Letts asserted that the dramatisation was entirely justified and indeed necessary. But in the theatrical stage publication, The Stage, the critic Paul Vale said that the play offered little in terms of resolution. The drama wasn't only on stage, though. In 2016, the highly acclaimed National Treasure aired on British television on Channel 4 and later became available on demand via the All4 digital platform. And this was a fictional dramatisation of the stories of abuse that were being revealed to the public throughout the Savile scandal and the ensuing kind of arrest of people like Hall and Harris. Now, I was really surprised when I was conducting this research to find that the show had sold incredibly well to international territories. And I think I was surprised because the material and the substance of the show, is very much about 1970s British television, popular television culture, light entertainment culture. So the idea that this had appeal to a range of different territories was really quite surprising to me. And just as some examples, the show sold to countries such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Spain, Croatia, Norway, Iceland, and Finland. It wasn't just sold in terms of broadcast television channels, it was also sold for in-flight deals as well. So in the UK, a deal was signed with the in-flight media company Sparfax. And there were a couple of DVD and video deals with companies like Just Licensing so that the show could be sold into the Netherlands and Flemish-speaking Belgium and Luxembourg, and also to RLJE International in the UK. So why am I going on about this? Karen Boyle's observation is really important here again, I think, and I'll just remind you of it, that she says television may also contribute towards finding solutions and new ways of telling these stories. And I think that when we reflect on the intrigue and interest in this topic and in this theme from so many international settings, it gives kind of credence to Boyle's argument here that the desperate pursuit of answers and solutions to the ever-going and unending kind of problem of abuse of children in particular is something that has global and transnational appeal. So in National Treasure, what we saw was how the structuring facts of the Savile scandal really got shifted and adapted to get transferred into a primetime fictional TV drama about this culture of predation in 1970s celebrity culture. So what I'm drawing attention to here is the fact that the evidence from the case gets reworked into fiction. So truth becomes fiction. And this seems to be the thing that allows the story to travel well beyond its original discursive frame. So the apparently very British context of the scandal around celebrity perpetrated abuse gets turned into this story with global appeal. And it's interesting, I think, here to reflect on a remark made by Robbie Coltrane, who plays the lead role in National Treasure, the TV show. He says, "I believe with all my soul that it's the job of drama to deal with things that the judiciary is not very good at, that the police aren't very good at, that the politicians aren't very good at, that the civil servants aren't very good at. But drama, it's not about entertaining, it's about finding out how people get like that." And this is the crux of the matter for me. I think one of the kind of insights that the sheer degree of interest in this case shows us is that we have an irresistible curiosity about how the minds of abusers work and how the process of dealing with the fallout from abuse is something that pulls us in and fascinates us seemingly without end. So what I'm getting at here is the fact that drama seems to explain things. It seems to help audiences to understand. And by implication, perhaps I'm suggesting to move on from the shock of these revelations. The example of Savile here apparently has transnational symbolic value. So presumably it works as a kind of condensed image of the very numerous failings of patriarchal sexism and the cultures of abuse that it engenders. The global trade around this TV show, National Treasure, and its profile as an award-winning, critically acclaimed drama are, I think, important waymarkers in understanding how the mediated landscape of this story has been traversed at the emotional and psychological levels. Now, the last layer of emerging archive material that I want to pay attention to in this timeline that I'm setting up refers to critical and academic scholarship that's been published in the wake of the scandal. And there's now quite a fair amount of this, with articles and books that examine the cultural and ideological significance of the case for feminism, for instance, but also in the context of understandings about celebrity culture and more broadly media industries and policy. Now, in my own work, what I'm trying to do is to deepen the understanding around the symbolic function of mediatised celebrity and mediatised celebrity scandal by analysing the psychological and emotional experiences that it invokes. So operating over time at representational, and affective and formal levels, I'm arguing, popular media provide important outlets for unconscious emotional experience. In other words, they create space for us to resist the idea that somehow celebrity is untouchable. I think that media also provide us with a valuable way of grappling with painful experience because they allow it to come to the surface and to be worked through. And the way that we identify as fans of celebrities taps into personal experiences as well, I think. As the scholar of celebrity, P. David Marshall, points out, and I'm quoting, "Affect is central for understanding the meaning and power of the celebrity in contemporary culture." Drawing on Sigmund Freud, Marshall argues that affect and its attribution are integral to the working of celebrity as what he calls a site for the housing of affect in terms of both the audience and the institutions that have worked to produce the cultural forms that have allowed the celebrity to develop. Now, I wish to go a bit further than Marshall goes here, and I want to say that celebrity doesn't merely provoke feelings or provide a vehicle for feelings. Instead, I think when we invest our feeling in celebrities, they also become psychological and emotional objects of our minds. And so they have an impact on how we feel about ourselves, our relationship to society, and to other people around us. And this special mode of attachment helps to account, I think, for the idealizing and denigrative behaviors of audiences around celebrity. And this entails both conscious and unconscious dimensions of our emotional lives. So I want to argue that in taking a psychoanalytic perspective derived from the work of Melanie Klein, we can understand exactly how these processes play out and to what end we use them. And we can do this firstly by focusing on relationships and the attachments experienced by celebrity audiences, but also by considering how these attachments change and evolve according to what we see in media content related to the celebrities in question. So I'm going to turn now to ask who will fix it for us? And I want to consider how we go about containing the fallout from the kind of toxic celebrity I'm examining here. So the timeline and archive sets that I've been discussing so far are really useful for thinking about the psychological processes at work in the distillation of the details of the Savile case into the fictional drama National Treasure. And there are two distinct phases involved, I think. So firstly, when we hear shocking revelations of any kind, an almost automatic human response involves denial and splitting, by which I mean thinking of things as either purely good or purely bad. And in any traumatic context, these responses tend to dominate. In the Savile case, of course, it took a really long time to surface clear evidence to show that the allegations against Savile were true. Eventually, official apologies started to be made and victims started to be believed, and the failings of organisational culture started to be admitted. More recently, as I've shown, the story started to be restaged, and this suggests a gradual move towards a more reparative and depressive model of thinking. And here I'm specifically drawing on the work of Melanie Klein, who suggests that depressive thinking is what allows us to tolerate feelings of guilt and the capacity to make up for bad things that we've done. The depressive position also allows us to feel ambivalent, and this is something that isn't possible in a more manic, infantile state of mind where we tend to do this dividing of seeing things as either purely good or purely bad. So what I want to try and do is show how National Treasure enables us to map the shift from an infantile state of mind to a more depressive one when it comes to the Savile case. And so I want to go a bit further now and analyse some of the media centred on Savile's life and death, and to note how the media never really lost its interest in him over the course of his lifetime, even once he was no longer a regular face on family TV. Now, this, of course, ensured the longevity of his celebrity status, and it's acknowledged in the field of celebrity studies that media surrounding celebrity allow us to explore common assumptions about celebrity lives and to revise what Cathy Fowler calls our collective memory of celebrities. So if we develop this understanding by thinking psychoanalytically, we begin to think about the complexity of some of the deepest workings of ideology, I think. And for me, this helps us to own and understand our own uncomfortable feelings around cases like the Savile one. So I just want to sit for a minute with this question of splitting and denial, because at the BBC, it's now acknowledged that the ongoing abuse of celebrity power and charisma perpetrated by so-called star employees like Savile was simultaneously seen and not seen. There seemed to be an unspoken understanding that abusive acts were taking place, but to use the phrase that was bandied about a lot at the time, the culture of the time was such that no one saw fit to speak out. Media coverage, as I've already shown, missed many opportunities to bring Savile to justice, and this was made very clear in ITV's documentary called Exposure, and in various long read articles published in broadsheet newspapers. So central to the act of turning a blind eye is the deployment of denial as a defense mechanism. So Melanie Klein argues that denial works for both psychological reality and external reality. But she points out that when we deny external reality, this can lead to psychosis. It can literally tip us over into psychotic madness. And of course, the psychotic patient often feels the urge to sadistically destroy the internal objects in their minds for fear that they will become poisonous inside them. And these ideas, I think, give us a really interesting framework for thinking about the development of the different responses to the Savile case. It's clear that initial responses to the accusations about Savile and other BBC stars led firstly to outright denial and subsequently to desperate efforts to eradicate all traces of any association to the stars. So, for example, the BBC archive has now actually been reworked so that Savile is completely edited out. The website for the TV show Top of the Pops 2, the nostalgic rescreening of Top of the Pops from the 70s and 80s, has been completely archived by the BBC. You can't find any kind of reference to it anymore on the internet. And many of the video clips showing Savile are now inaccessible, suggesting that evidence of his celebrity status at the corporation has actually been buried. And this seems like a really clear attempt by the organisation to dissociate the larger organisational body from the behaviour of its former employees. And it also works in a kind of double-voiced way to both eradicate or deny their history inside the organisation, whilst also removing the shaming evidence of the act of denial itself. It's a really complicated situation. Now, this eradication of the good turned bad object has been writ large right across the scandal. The BBC response in 2012 did seem rather manic and paradoxical as they tried to foster the memory of Savile as both good and bad after his death. On the one hand, they were celebrating him as a national treasure, while on the other hand, at the same time as doing this, and inside the same organisation, producers and investigative reporters were preparing material for an edition of Newsnight intended to unveil evidence of his abusive behaviour. But this contradictory response wasn't confined to the BBC. The media and public response to Savile's death was also quite manic. So he was widely celebrated in the aftermath of his death, but there was also simultaneously a uniformly horrified response to the accusations of abuse. And all of this, I think, is usefully symbolised in media images of, firstly, the very grand headstone marking Savile's grave when he was buried, and then its destruction and desecration only a matter of weeks afterwards, once the revelations had been published. So denial wasn't just alive and well at the BBC, it was all around. And as the truth started to emerge, so did the violent, destructive impulses designed to attack internalized idealized objects that have let us down. And what this seems to be about for me is the fear of experiencing poisonous feelings inside us. It's almost as though the prospect of having to give up our nostalgic memories of Savile as an idealized childhood figure created a need for a virulent rejection of the idea that he'd ever been meaningful in the first place. In this context, denial enables us to carry on in the face of traumatic distress. For the everyday media consumer, I'm suggesting, denial effectively repeated the experience of those who had been abused. It illustrates how forgetting is a logical response to anxiety and traumatic experience. And as I mentioned earlier, Boyle suggests that each of the Savile documentaries builds on the other, repeating the experience of abuse until it can be heard. So this is also about a cultural process of enabling us to listen to the experiences of those who have suffered abuse. So of course, here we're very much in the infantile, manic, splitting state of mind where everything is felt as either uniformly good or absolutely terrible. And this is what Klein refers to as the paranoid schizoid mentality. And in this state of mind, experience is deeply coloured with anxiety and a sense of fragmentation and persecution. And I think Klein's ideas help us to understand how we come to empathise with those who have suffered abuse. It isn't surprising then that there seemed to be lots of splitting at work in terms of the BBC response to the scandal. But this mechanism was also in show in the media coverage of the events and their audience reception. So to illustrate this, I want to bring you back to the end of 2011 when Savile died. And in their end-of-year coverage of the death of famous people, various newspapers tended towards a split between the loss of so-called legends, who included Savile, but also other people like Elizabeth Taylor and Henry Cooper, whom we would apparently miss, and the loss of villains such as Osama bin Laden, Colonel Gaddafi, and Kim Jong-il, whom we most certainly would not miss. In the wake of Savile's death, there was quite extraordinary scenes all over the UK press about covering Savile's funeral and the extraordinary public event that it became. And stories abounded about members of the public making requests to reserved burial plots next to Savile's burial plot. And the press seemed to positively revel in the 3-day-long funeral, which drew 5,000 guests, many of whom themselves were celebrities, and of course, many, many public mourners onto the streets to bear witness to Savile, who was described as a showman until the end. So there was an almost ubiquitous display of sorrow and grief immediately following on his death. Writing in The Independent, the journalist Tom Sutcliffe suggested that Savile's was the perfect exit. And on the surface, the tributes and memorials to him followed a rather paternalistic narrative, depicting him as a national treasure, a celebrity philanthropist, and a cherished eccentric. But at the same time, though, there were several newspaper reports that contained coy riders about the star's character and its questionable nature. So writing in the Daily Mirror, for instance, Routledge playfully referenced Savile's close friendship with Margaret Thatcher, highlighting the unlikeliness of this relationship. He said maybe he was doing penance for something we'll never know about. Presciently, in The Guardian, the journalist Wainwright observed what he called the little drop of acid in many tributes. And elsewhere, The Observer discussed Savile's egomania and his image as an enigmatic figure who gave some improbable and extraordinary interviews about what they called his unusual lifestyle. So this was all highly euphemistic, to say the least. Now, before his death, in those interviews I mentioned earlier with Barbara and Theroux, these interviews had given voice to concerns about Savile's sexual predilections, and Savile seemed to delight in making seemingly enigmatic statements that read in hindsight like admissions of guilt. So, for example, this excerpt from his interview with Louis Theroux, in which Theroux asks, "Why do you say in interviews that you hate children when I've seen you with kids and you clearly enjoy their company and have good rapport with them?" Right, obviously I don't hate them, that's number one. Yes, so why would you say that then? Because we live in a very funny world, and it's easier for me as a single man to say I don't like children because that puts a lot of salacious tabloid people off the hunt. Are you basically saying that so tabloids don't, pursue this whole is he, isn't he a paedophile line, basically? Yes, oh I. How do they know whether I am or not? How does anybody know whether I am? Nobody knows whether I am or not. I know I'm not. So I can tell you from experience that the easy way of doing it, when they say, oh, you've got all those children on, Jim will fix it, I say, yeah, I hate them. Yeah, to me that sounds more suspicious in a way though, hard luck, because it seems so awful. Well, that's my policy, that's the way it goes. Really? That's what I do, and it's worked a dream. This isn't the only example. Other journalists reported that Savile described being convinced that he would see his dead mother again in heaven. And he stated to other journalists that if I arrive at the gates of heaven and St. Peter says, "You've been a very tricky man, you can't come in here," I'll break his thumbs. I'm qualified to do that from being a wrestler, and I've never had a problem with anyone whose thumbs I've broken. I think these quotations speak for themselves. To an extent, Savile must have been aware of the potential for his crimes to be uncovered after his death. As the Daily Telegraph obituary suggested, his public persona was his best camouflage, and the public reification of celebrity provided Savile with a remarkably effective armour during his lifetime, and for a short while at least, beyond it as well. Following on from his lying in state in a gold coffin, and I'm not making this up, Savile had requested that his casket be encased in concrete before being buried, unconsciously once again gesturing towards this fear that he might be discovered. His desire for this impenetrable grave would put him securely out of reach for any posthumous investigation. So what I think is that these examples show that it wasn't only the BBC that turned a blind eye to Savile's behaviour. The broader media consensus did the same thing, and members of the public colluded with this as they persisted in their adulation of the star. We just have to think about the number of remembrance collections that were made following on from his death to understand this. And of course, there's something rather perverse going on in all of this. And I was interested to see the organisation psychologist Susan Long's definition of the perverse state of mind, which she suggests acknowledges reality, but at the same time denies it. It engages others as accomplices in this perversion and may flourish where instrumental relations have dominance in the society. And she says this is because instrumentality ignores the rights of others to have an independent existence. This in itself is abusive. the perverse state of mind turns a blind eye. So the perversity at work also extends to the broader policy context and the everyday experience of individuals, I think. And it's linked with patriarchal forms of authority and organizational structures, where the emphasis is on ethical formations that privilege a very particular kind of masculinism. And I think this is a point made very, very well in the work of Karen Boyle on the Savile scandal and feminist kind of approaches to it. But over time, I think the benefit of distance and objectivity on perverse experience eventually comes to light. And in Kleinian terms, this involves making a shift from that paranoid schizoid thinking towards the depressive thinking where we can acknowledge guilt and reparative inclinations. So I want to think a little bit about guilt and reparation for a moment. Now, Melanie Klein argues that perverse behavior is destructive and leads to feelings of hatred and revenge. But eventually, she says, these give way to unconscious guilt and the impulse to make reparation in an effort to restore loving object relations in an atmosphere of care, so that an atmosphere of care and creative relatedness can thrive. And she suggests that, she suggests that only when consideration has been given to the part that destructive impulses play in the interaction of hate and love, is it possible to show the ways in which feelings of love and tendencies to reparation develop in connection with aggressive impulses and in spite of them. So for Klein, the idealization of figures like celebrities and beloved fictional characters entails what she calls a turning outward of love and admiration. And this protects us against the unconscious fear of what she describes as the gloom and hate of lovelessness, a state that's felt to be dangerous to the self and others. When this kind of idealization fails, despair and anxiety become all too real, and those splitting and destructive defense mechanisms I described earlier come into play. But the drive to keep our love objects safely in mind is incredibly important because it helps us to preserve the possibility of loving and being loved. So guilt soon comes into play as a result, and this helps us to make up for all the bad feelings and the imagined kind of bad fantasies and acts that we are responsible for, restoring the possibility of sustaining relatedness in the face of anxiety about death, loss, and isolation. So in the case of the Savile scandal, I think what Boyle describes as an insistence in the documentary archive on voicing the experience of some of the victims leads to a form of guilt by association. I idealized the perpetrator with whom an aspect of my mind was identified, and therefore by association, I must partially bear responsibility for the acts inflicted. Guilt on the behalf of the perpetrator arises and allows us as audiences and creative artists to put it to good use. As Klein has it, this feeling of guilt acts as an incentive to make reparation. So it's in this context that I find it really fascinating that the reparative work around the Savile scandal comes on the back of a very particular kind of documentary that takes the shape of fictional dramatization. And here I'm thinking specifically about National Treasure. In this show, the creatives displace the specific details of the Savile scandal by creating characters that become symbolic condensations of the different BBC perpetrators who've been investigated under Utree. And I think it's especially important that, according to the press, the ending of National Treasure left audiences with a very mixed reaction, with some describing their sense that the acquittal of Paul Finchley, the main character, played by Robbie Coltrane in the series finale, was very disappointing, even though his wife, Marie, played by Julie Walters, had decided to leave him. And journalists tended to seize on the social media commentary. There's a lot of commentary on Twitter and Facebook about this show. And they talked about audiences feeling that justice hadn't been done. And they remarked on the many unanswered questions that the show left as it came to an end. So for some viewers, fiction didn't seem to bring the closure that they were so desperately seeking around this case, or the closure that they needed following on from this loss of faith in the reliability of their idealized celebrity star figures. For others, though, this feeling adds to a sense that the series should be hailed as a triumph because it portrays how sex abuse victims are treated by the criminal justice system. In other words, what this series achieves is showing us what it feels like to be a victim of abuse of any kind, because closure can never be experienced. It can never be brought, no matter how much justice is done, no matter how much retribution might be made. So this deeply ambivalent response to the series also tells us something about the psychological processes around the case. Being able to tolerate ambivalent feelings is an absolutely key element for our capacity for feelings of guilt and regret, desire to make up for our wrongs. And for Klein, ambivalence lets us see objects as both good and bad at the same time. So we develop a capacity to bear the hatred that we feel inside without fear of totally destroying our relationships to beloved objects. In other words, ambivalence lets us re-evaluate loving impulses, whilst also being able to ward off tendencies toward hatred and repulsion. And we develop a capacity to bear disappointment and to learn from experience. As I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the tabloid reviews of the series finale were really taken with the social media commentary about it and made a lot of viewers ambivalence. In the Times, there was an interview with one of the other stars of the show, Andrea Risborough, who suggested that the drama somehow created space for the public to process their own experiences. And in the Telegraph, they stated that this shone a powerful beam back at audiences like us who help monsters onto pedestals, all the while sparing a thought for the victims. The Guardian concluded that this was a powerful example of how the issues of a news story can be explored through TV drama. It's really important, I think, to think about the casting choices in this show as well, and to reflect on the psychological processing that the choice of these key players promotes. In National Treasure, the production team used very reliable National Treasure celebrities in the main roles, actors who bring with them a particularly warm sense of trustworthy security and a sense of comfort and reassurance that comes from their familiarity. And this goes against the grain, the absolute grain of our experience of the Savile scandal and its role in wrecking the relationships in our minds to star figures. So in this way, I think celebrity becomes rehabilitated, and the escapist feel-good uses to which celebrity is often put is rescued for us as fans and followers. And in National Treasure, of course, the choice of Coltrane and Walters for the main parts is really interesting. They're perhaps best known for their work together in the Harry Potter cycle of films, movies in which the wish fulfillment of childhood fictions and the pleasures of magical thinking are central, themes, of course, that resonate uncannily with Savile's Jim Will Fix It. Now, Coltrane and Walters seem to act as secure objects to whom the painful task of reassurance can be entrusted. And this is important because it gives us context for the show's acclaim and its very impressive international sales history, as I discussed earlier on. So I'm arguing that the fictional turn in the archive has a really distinctive containing function and provides the kind of reassurance and security required for our capacity for psychological going on being in the face of horrendous revelations about abuse. In a similar vein, I think the emerging academic archive of work on the Savile scandal also helps to symbolise and bring into view political and critical perspectives on the ideology and celebrity culture that allowed the Savile case to evolve over time in the ways that it did. I'm going to come back again to Boyle's view that television contributes toward finding solutions and new ways of telling these stories, because I think this is really important, but I think we need to go a bit further, and we need to take into account the way that documentary, fiction, and academic commentary also contribute to society's capacity for recovery and rehabilitation. It's not just about telling the stories, it's about recovering from them. Over time, both popular media and critical research provide really important outlets, I think, for unconscious emotional experience. They give us space to resist narratives that contrive celebrity as somehow untouchable. And mediatisation gives us a really helpful and valuable way to grapple with painful experience, helping it to come to the surface and get worked through, and allowing us to hold on to the value of celebrity in our minds as something that allows us to experience aspects of our sense of self and our place in the world. So this entanglement between mediatisation, critical research and celebrity culture, for me, creates important psychological space to make sense of our own lived experience and shows how mediatisation and critical commentary help to enact what I think of as a therapeutic dynamic. In turn, I want to suggest this creates new cultural spaces to envision the kinds of social and political shifts that are required if, as is so often proclaimed, cases such as this should never again be permitted to go unchecked. Thank you very much for listening.